Good evening, everybody. I'm Jewel Amoa, and I'm the Human Rights and Equity Advisor with the Halton District School Board. I would like to welcome you to the Director's Panel series on identity, inclusion, and human rights. And our inaugural panel this evening is entitled Antisemitism, the Longest Hatred. I will begin by acknowledging the land. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walk before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. Director Innes?
Thank you so much, Jewel. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Director's Series on Inclusion, Identity, and Human Rights. This is an opportunity for us to enhance the great work that our schools are doing to support our equity team under the leadership of Superintendent Rob Etov. I wanted to take this opportunity to shine additional light on a number of topics affecting students, families, and communities we serve, to create better understanding of each other with the ultimate goal of eliminating discrimination and hate in all its ugly forms, and to foster greater understanding of different identities. On one such topic is anti-Semitism. We're never far from being reminded of the hate and violence of anti-Semitism. For many in the Jewish community, this is often too regular an occurrence. We understand that anti-Semitism is within the broader community and our society at large. And while we accept this ugly reality, we do not accept that we must live with this scourge for all times. At the Halton District School Board, we believe that we can be more than just a reflection of society. We believe that we can be leaders of society. And as leaders, we must set the example that hate, discrimination, and exclusion that we see too often have no home in our schools. We approach the work of eradicating anti-Semitism with hope and optimism. What we do can lead to different outcomes and better experiences, not just for our Jewish students, staff, families, and communities, but indeed for all of us collectively as part of the human family. I welcome you this evening.
So we have a dynamic panel of 6 speakers who are with us this evening. So what I will do is I will introduce the entire panel, and then they will speak for a few moments in the order in which I have introduced them. And so to begin, we have Dr. Karen Mock, who's a human rights advocate and educator. Karen Mock is a human rights advocate, consultant, psychologist, and educator. She is the former executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, and the past president of JSpace. Karen is an active founding member of the Equity Summit Group, the Enhancing Social Justice Education Group, the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, and co-founder of the Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group. She's on the board of the Pearson Center for Progressive Policy and on the advisory board of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Among the many honors received for her work spanning over 40 years, Karen was granted the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for service to her peers, community, and country, and was inducted into the Order of Canada in 2017. Following Karen, we will hear from Rabbi Stephen Wise, who's a spiritual leader of Sharai Beth El Congregation of Oakville. Rabbi Wise was ordained from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 2005. He has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Toronto and a Master's of Arts from Brandeis University. Rabbi Wise is on the Executive Interfaith Council of Halton, chair of the Reform Rabbis of Greater Toronto, and a member of the Halton Police Service Multi-Faith Task Force. Rabbi Wise is excited to be part of a congregation as diverse and storied and unique as Sharai Beth El. He teaches thought-provoking courses for adults and children, and he enjoys being a catalyst for social activism. Rabbi Wise is an author and speaker on Israel and her role in Tikkun Olam with his first book, Israel, Repairing the World. Following Rabbi Wise, we will hear from Sharon Kavkin-Binstock, a McMaster University student and former Halton District School Board student. Sharon is completing a Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology and Genetics co-op program at McMaster University, and she graduates this year. Before attending university, Sharon was a student in the Halton District School Board, where she was the president of the youth group at Shirai Bethel Synagogue. At university, Sharon has been involved with Hillel, a Jewish organization on campus. Following Sharon, we'll hear from Esther Retty, who's a grade 12 student within the Halton District School Board. Throughout her life, education and inclusivity have been a point of interest, leading Esther to not only seek out to educate herself on how to help the disadvantaged, but also to be part of school leadership opportunities, including the Gay Straight Alliance, Equity and Diversity Club, and being an English as a second language ambassador. Esther is active in her community, most notably through her job as a teaching assistant and volunteer efforts, as well as her involvement in her synagogue's youth group. Esther loves to study the diversity of people, culture, food, language, religion, history, as she believes that this knowledge is the cornerstone of equity. Jess Burke, the Director, Community Training and Campus Advocacy at the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, or CEJA. Jess, whose pronouns are she, her, they, them, is an activist who focuses on anti-oppression and the inclusion of anti-Semitism in anti-racism practices. She has worked extensively with interreligious, queer, and equity-seeking communities across Canada. Jess identifies as a queer Jew who advocates for women and gender non-conforming representation in politics, combating anti-Semitism in progressive spaces, intersectional frameworks when addressing oppression in both digital and published communications. Jess has supported equity, diversity, and inclusion departments coast to coast across post-secondary, not-for-profit, human rights commissions, and non-governmental organizations. Additionally, they have worked as an independent consultant and are formerly the coordinator for the University of Calgary's Multi-Faith Center. Jess identifies as equal parts Canadian and Israeli. In completing our panel this evening, we have Bernie Farber, who's the chair of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Bernie's career spans more than 3 decades, focused on human rights, diversity, and inter-ethnic faith and race relations. Recognized and called upon by the courts, media, and law enforcement as an expert in human and civil rights, he is one of the few in the field to be accepted by the Canadian courts as an expert in hate crime, white supremacy, and anti-racism. His efforts have been documented in numerous Canadian human rights publications, books, films, newspapers, and magazines. He has also been cited for his expertise in a number of academic publications. Mr. Farber has successfully run large NGOs and foundations such as Canadian Jewish Congress, the Paloma Foundation, and the Mosaic Institute, all focused on creating a better society. And so now I will turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Karen Mock.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be included in this panel on such an important and very timely topic. I think our biggest challenge this evening is the opening speech is to be within 5 minutes, not a prepared speech, but from the heart, and to cover our own backgrounds and our own experience with anti-Semitism. So I need to say right up front that I come at this as an educator, and that it has been my life's work to work in an atmosphere of human rights. We didn't call it equity and inclusion and diversity and anti-racism when I was growing up, but I am an educational psychologist by training and a teacher educator. My first many years in the field were in teacher education. And it became clear to me that when it came to human rights and racism, that our biggest challenge was putting theory and policy into practice. I did end up being one of the other few that Bernie describes, being qualified by the Canadian courts as an expert on anti-Semitism, racism, human rights, hate groups, and so on. But As a psychologist and as a teacher who takes a very child-centered approach, to me, the biggest challenge in education has been, by some, and I'll have to say it this way, the failure to put theory and policy into practice. How do we justify when people are teaching in an environment where the highest position of a person of color is the caretaker? How do we justify then to say that every child needs role models and needs to learn to be the best they can be, and then have people fight against employment equity and say seniority should be the only issue? We've come a long way with most of us being able to recognize racism in all its forms. When I was growing up, and I was in, at the time, grade 13, a teacher looked at my class and said to a Catholic boy, "Your work is a sin to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." And then turned to some of the Jewish students and said, "And you Jews think that because you're Jewish, you don't have to study. It's just going to come easy for you." Was she a bigot? Absolutely. She had to hand a lot of us, my Catholic friend and myself, prizes. But at the same time, we had no recourse. Well, anti-Semitism, and you'll hear later as the longest hatred, comes in waves. And why did I, after a long career in teacher education in the universities, decide to go full-time into human rights when I took the job as head of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith? It was because in the late 80s, when I was actually hired by a government department called the Race Relations Directorate to do training on how they do education and training in anti-racism and anti-oppression work, that I perceived that even in the anti-racism movement in those days, anti-Semitism was on the rise, and was told even by one of the managers in that department, "Well, Jews aren't our clients. Jews aren't victims of oppression or discrimination. They have wealth and power." And the communications director at the time said to me, "Karen, why is it that Jews are all so good in business?" And I thought to myself, what do I do at this one? When they hit your hot buttons, as we say in education, take a deep breath and give the empathetic response. It sounds to me as if you think, and I put it back to her, and we went to lunch and we went into our teaching and counseling mode until she actually realized that she was so embedded in the stereotypes that she didn't see that it was her business to teach against stereotypes. When the job for the League for Human Rights came up, I thought, you know what? It's time to do what you do in your own community. And then I was very pleased that we were able in the early 90s to bring people together to fight this. And I know we shouldn't use military language, but to struggle together against all forms of racism. And we can tell you stories around that, and I will, and the resources. And I was so pleased that a chapter that I did on anti-Semitism and the implications for anti-racism was accepted in a textbook edited by Carl James. So we have these resources available, and we are now in a cycle again. As head of the Race Relations Foundation, I actually had a very prominent person in our work say to me, "Well, Karen, you better not be too Jewish in this job." And I was commended for doing my job when I spoke out against every form of racism. But when we put out a statement, when a Jewish library was firebombed in Canada, I was accused of speaking out against anti-Semitism because I was a Jew. So here we are again, where we have a lot of work to do, both within communities and between communities, to put into practice what we preach. I was honored to be asked to be the senior policy advisor to the Minister of Education, then Kathleen Wynne, to develop and deliver the equity and inclusive education strategy. But today, in our work, I'm often called on in the education sector because the norms that we have in anti-racism and anti-oppression work today in diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces end up in many cases not being applied to anti-Semitism. My time is up for now, but when we get to the questions and answers, we'll be glad to continue to offer resources in what is the longest hatred.
Thank you, Dr. Karen Mock. Thank you so much for those opening statements and words. We look forward to more of what you have to say during our question and answer. At this time, I'm going to invite Rabbi Stephen Weiss to take the floor. Go ahead, Rabbi Weiss.
Thank you, Curtis. And Jewel, thank you for inviting us to this panel. I'm so impressed by the Halton board that you chose this topic of anti-Semitism to lead this really impressive series of events, which I know will go on throughout the next few months. And I thank you, Karen, because you really gave that overarching view of anti-Semitism and why the title is The Longest Hatred, because you think it's going to go away and then it doesn't. And I think that's why it's so important to be talking about it tonight. My parents are children of Holocaust survivors. My grandparents escaped from Nazi-held Poland and miraculously made their way into a DP camp with three children in tow. Were placed on a ship bound for Canada, didn't know anyone and having lost their entire family and started a new life here in Canada. And they raised their children in the hope that this would be a country that would, allow for Jews to, have access to education, to business, to purchase property, to be able to, have full freedoms. And for the most part, they have. But sadly, this anti-Semitism kind of just lurks around the corner. And I thought when I was going to school that it was going away. I found myself in a world where I was proud to be Jewish and to show my Jewishness. But there were moments when I encountered anti-Semitism. Typically would happen. I was in a Jewish school, so it typically would happen outside the school. I didn't have the experience you had, Karen, but I remember distinctly representing my Jewish school in athletics and being taunted, things thrown at us, pennies thrown at us. A group stole some of our sports equipment during a soccer match. Someone spit and sort of attacked us at a bus stop one time. A few Jewish students, we all had our kippahs on. So I was thinking 80s and 90s. Okay, maybe there's a little blip, and maybe it'll get lower and lower as the years go on. I've been here in the Halton region for many years, and I would hope that the students that I teach would probably say, "Oh, it doesn't happen anymore, Rabbi." And yet I asked them just a few weeks ago if they have experienced anti-Semitism in the high schools here in the Halton region and middle schools. Some of them are in grade 7 and 8. And each kid had a story to tell of a teacher maybe not quite understanding maybe a Jewish holiday and sort of putting a test on that day, of a school board, putting the first day of school on a important Jewish holiday. I don't think that's anti-Semitism, but I just think it's in the spirit of inclusion. It didn't really feel good for these kids. Kids have been taunted or jokes at their expense in the hallway. And I was, that really hurts me to the core. But I will say that what I'm noticing, especially in Halton region, is our police services are fantastic. They have been embracing this diversity and training their officers properly. They are so responsive. They are aware. They are on the front lines. They care deeply about this synagogue and the community and are always helping out. They're all over the place and trying to fight anti-Semitism. And I will say that the town of Oakville recently passed the world agreed on what anti-Semitism is, and they put together this I think maybe Bernie will talk about it later, but the UNRWA, and I'm using the acronym, it's a definition of anti-Semitism that the world has accepted. And the province of Ontario has accepted it and passed it. The Canada's passed it, and Oakville passed it, and Halton Hills passed it. I'm waiting for Burlington and Milton to come along. But what that meant was that when an incident happened in Oakville or in these areas, that the police have the ability to stop the crimes, or if they happen, to prosecute the criminals as not just mischief or, oh, they painted a swastika somewhere, but that this is a hate crime, and people have to face the consequences. And there were 2 young adults who spray painted swastikas and negative statements and stereotypes against Jews and Blacks on City Hall, and they were prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And I was really happy to see that the consequences were paid for that. And I think it's an example for our whole community, for all of Halton Region. I agree with Karen when she said that education is so important. I really think that the schools in Halton Region should have the Holocaust on their curriculum in the history classes in grade 9 or 10, whenever they take history, that it shouldn't just be a paragraph in the textbook or maybe a little picture, but actually they should talk about it, maybe for a day, maybe a day or 2. And because the lessons of the Holocaust aren't just about hatred against Jews, it's hatred against humanity. It's what happens when you stereotype against one people. And when it can happen to one people, it can happen to anybody. And the saddest lesson of that is the Holocaust, is the genocide, is the murder of 6 million targeted Jews in the last century. And I hope that will never happen again. So again, I want to thank the invitation. I want to thank you, Jewel and Curtis, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm excited to hear my fellow panelists, especially our young people who I know are coming up next, Sharon and Esther, to hear your firsthand experiences. I think it'll be very valuable to us panelists and to everyone who is listening. Thank you, Curtis.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Weiss. We sure appreciate your words and your opening remarks. At this time, we're going to ask Sharon Kavkayan-Binstock, who is, as Jewel mentioned earlier, a former HDSB student. Sharon, you now have the floor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sharon, and I'm really excited to be here to talk to everyone about anti-Semitism and what needs to be done to eliminate it in schools. As mentioned before, I've been an active member of the Jewish community at Sherry Bethel, as serving president of the youth group to help plan events and bring Jewish students together in the Halton region. Growing up as a Jewish student in the Halton region, I was often one of very few Jewish students in my school and in the classroom. And I really hope to bring that perspective to our discussions today and how important education is in combating anti-Semitism. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel and represent my voice in these conversations, and I hope to contribute to the greater understanding of the experience of the Jewish people. I'm really excited to learn from the other panelists. I feel like I've already learned so much, and thank you so much for having me today on this panel.
Thank you so much, Sharon. At this time, I'm going to ask Esther, who is a current student within the Halton District School Board, to take the floor. Go ahead, Esther.
Thank you. So I'd just like to start off by saying thank you for this opportunity. I think this is a really amazing thing that we're doing. As people have said before, anti-Semitism is just such a prominent part of our society. It truly is interwoven into pretty much every aspect, whether it's in our school curriculums, in our textbooks, in the language we use, even storybook characters. It truly is everywhere, and it's unfortunate to see that such a powerful and old hatred, which is so prominent, is so often ignored and pushed to the side and not talked about. My family and I were all immigrants from East Europe. We're immigrants from Hungary, and we endured such horrific levels of anti-Semitism, especially my parents and my grandparents, whenever they talked to me about their childhood experiences, what it was like in school, what their friends and teachers would say. It just breaks my heart, and it's horrible. And we moved to Canada with such big hopes that we would have a better life. And while we do, anti-Semitism, as it often does, didn't go away, not even in the slightest. It just sort of morphed into a different form, and people were better at hiding it. As a young kid, I felt really disconnected from my Judaism, as Sharon said, especially I feel like within the Halton Board. There are so few Jewish people. I mean, even at my school currently, I think there's about 1,000 people. I can count on one hand how many Jewish students we have, and that's really unfortunate. So I definitely felt very disconnected from my Judaism as a kid. Also, living in a very Christianized society, such as Canada, it's difficult for people of other religions, I think, to kind of reconcile with themselves who they are, that they're different from other people, especially when you're a young child and you don't really understand these things. I was also very scared to tell people I was Jewish just because I've kind of internalized such anti Semitism that if I wear a Star of David necklace, if I miss a day of school because there's a holiday, or, I maybe talk about the fact that I celebrated a Jewish holiday when I was in school, I was really, really afraid of that. And I think that's why it's so important to have student voices like Sharon and I, because we know firsthand what it's like currently for students. And I think it's so important that other Jewish students who are maybe afraid of their identity or who want to speak up about these issues, or who've never seen, someone like us on a board like this, it's important to have that kind of voice and inclusivity. We do have anti-Semitism in the Halton Board, whether it's through teachers, our curriculums, and our textbooks, and that's definitely something that needs to be addressed. So I am very happy that I got the opportunity to do this. I've been through it all. I have had taunts at myself. I've had things thrown at me. I've had teachers say things about me. I've seen anti-Semitic things in textbooks, in our curriculums. I lived in Israel during a war and have been bombed, so I really have been through it all. And that's definitely something that I do want to bring to this discussion, to kind of bring to light just how bad anti-Semitism is really in this day, because unfortunately, the levels are rising exponentially, and it's really scary for us. So that's definitely something that I think is important to acknowledge and to talk about. And again, thank you so much for having me on the board. I'm really excited to share my opinion and to hear all the opinions of everybody else, to hopefully shed some light onto this situation and talk about how we can move forward and improve.
Thank you so much, Esther, for raising that very important voice. Thank you for your courage to speak and to give you the opportunity to share your experiences with us. At this time, I'm going to ask Jess Burke to take the floor. Jess, go ahead.
Thank you, Director Ennis. Thank you, everyone, for having me here this evening. I'm very excited to be among such esteemed panelists. If I might, I'm probably most excited to learn from Esther and Sharon, so it's beautiful to be here. I think when I started in this field, I was often considered the next generation, and I inhabit this unique space now where it's really beautiful to see who I perceive as the next generation of leaders. I do want to talk about my personal experience. My name is Jess Burke. I think my name just comes up as JB. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. In my personal experience, I felt safer coming out as queer in high school and university than I did coming out as Jewish. And that has informed most of my experience. I am a third-generation Holocaust survivor, also from Hungary. And I learned my family's history as though it was a work of fiction for the first time that I encountered it in school curriculum. While working in post-secondary educational spaces, I was present when Jews were spoken about as a historical group who existed in the past tense and not like we were here and now. When anti-Semitism was referenced, frozen in time, like it ended in 1945, when Holocaust denial was present, I was informed that it was not anti-Semitic, nor was it violent. And all the while, I heard microaggressions from friends and colleagues reporting back to me what it was that they heard. Things like, I love this neighborhood, but it's so Jewy. Or that 3 Jews control all the world banks. Or jokes like, how many Jews can you fit in a Volkswagen? 2 in the front, 3 in the back, and 6 million in an ashtray. When I reported these things, they were called bullying. They were never named as anti-Semitism. I experienced a lack of intercultural competency when I had to take sick days on Yom Kippur so I could fast, or when I had work meetings that went late on Friday nights, or when I didn't have access to kosher food. I also witnessed anti-Semitism when an op-ed writer for the Globe and Mail published how COVID-19 allowed her to channel her inner Anne Frank, commenting on social isolation during the pandemic. I experienced anti-Semitism when I was told that I was inherently privileged and that I should not be included in anti-racism and equity-seeking spaces like this. I am grateful to the Halton District School Board for hosting this panel and for the Director's Series. I've taken a look at the upcoming panelists and upcoming topics, and they are pertinent to this moment, to this era, to being in a digital environment, and to combating oppression across groups. I have worked extensively with school boards in Ontario, specifically with EDI, or Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion offices, social science departments, and institutionally based anti-oppression coaches. What I know is this: data shows an increase in anti-Semitism. Reports that we get from community security metrics also depict a clear rise in anti-Semitism. Certainly in the month of May, during the most recent escalation between Israel and Gaza, but moreover, a consistent and steady rise dating back over decades that is not connected to any region other than our own. This is measured both quantitatively and qualitatively. Anti-Semitic hate crimes have increased, as too have hate crimes increased significantly across other marginalized and equity-seeking communities. A survey of 4,161,578,905 individuals by the ADL indicated that more than 1 billion individuals worldwide harbor anti-Semitic beliefs. Their questions included things like, do Jews have too much power in the business world? To which 35% of people agreed. Or did Jews have too much power in international financial markets? To which 34% of people agreed. And that Jews still talk too much about what happened in the Holocaust, in which 30% of people agree. They also surveyed questions about control in government, global affairs, that Jewish people think that they are better than others, and the one that stood out to me the most, that people hate Jews because of the way Jews behave, coming in at 32%. Panels like this are of the utmost importance now and always. I'm thrilled to be here with Halton Region and to be able to have this conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it is timely. I won't take up any more time, but I am very pleased to be here with my other esteemed panelists and also with the Human Rights Committee and panelists. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation this evening.
Thank you so much, Jess. Look forward to hearing more from you later on. And then this time I'm going to invite Bernie Farber to come forward and give his opening statement. Go ahead, Bernie.
Thank you. Thank you, Curtis, for inviting me, and Jewel for all the work that you've done here. And thank you to all the other panelists. I feel honored to be with you. I was especially, I have to say, taken by both Esther and Jess describing their own recent history with anti-Semitism, because as you can see, I've been around a little bit longer than they have. And yet I can go back to my upbringing in the 1950s and 60s in school in Ottawa, where I was usually one of only a couple of Jews in school. And I can tell you that the experiences that I heard from both Jess and Esther mirror exactly what happened to me all those years ago. So all this to say is that anti-Semitism, which is in itself an interesting word, I'll get back to in a moment, still exists. This is why they call it the longest hatred. But anti-Semitism, what is it? In essence, and let's be very clear about this, it is Jew hatred. Theodor Adorno, a wonderful philosopher, actually, in my view, described it better than all of the definitions that are struggling today to take precedence. Rabbi Weiss had mentioned the IHRA definition, that's the International Holocaust Restitution Association, Education Association's definition, which is pretty well accepted worldwide. Right now, there are issues around it, but there will always be issues around definitions of hatred. There is the Jerusalem Declaration, which is another definition of anti-Semitism. There is the Nexus definition, another definition of anti-Semitism. But Theodor Adorno described anti-Semitism beautifully. He said it is a rumor about the Jews. And every time you take a look at Jew hatred throughout the centuries, whether it was Jews poisoning wells, whether it was kidnapping Christian children, whether it was our success in business, whether it was our control in Hollywood, it all hinges on one issue, that it was a rumor about the Jews. Now, I come to this with some clarity and with some history. Rabbi Weiss spoke about being a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Jess spoke about being a Holocaust survivor, third or fourth generation. I am the son of a Holocaust survivor. My late father was the sole Jewish survivor from his town in Poland during World War II. 750 Jews lived in Bochka amongst a population of about 3,000. When the war was over, he was the only one left standing. His first wife, his 2 children, 7 brothers and sisters, cousins, friends, and relatives no longer existed. They were wiped out. And they were wiped out because people believed in hatred of Jews. They believed in the rumor of Jews, that Jew hatred is just all amongst us. And I think the interesting thing, what I would like to leave before we get into our question period, is this important part. We have to understand that anti-Semitism, like hatreds of many kind, go in peaks and valleys. And of course, after World War II, after the Holocaust, the Shoah, as we refer to it, the murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, amongst them 1.5 million children under the age of 10, either shot, starved to death, or thrown into gas chambers. After the Holocaust, we saw a decline. Didn't last very long. 50s and 60s, where I was growing up, as I said, I don't think a day went by that I didn't have to suffer the taunts and the slings and arrows of Jew hatred. Into the 60s, it began to rise again, 70s and 80s. We had the Heritage Front, we had neo-Nazis coming back again. And today, what about today? What about today, this very day? We are seeing anti-Semitism in the guise of convoys that overtook Ottawa, that came to Toronto, and amongst those, not all of them, clearly not all of them, but amongst those participating in those events, we see Nazis waving Nazi flags. We see anti-Semitism making its presence very clear. It just never goes away. And so what we hope to accomplish this evening is understand clearly that although you see me in front of you with my white skin, privileged for sure, I still remember every single day of growing up. I remember my history, and Jews may from time to time have good points in history, but the fact is that Jew hatred, there are always rumors about the Jews, and the better we are educated, and the more that we talk about this, the more that we will be able to find ways to at least blunt it. I'm not sure it will ever go away, but I think we have the opportunity through sessions like this, and I want to commend the Halton Board of Education for doing this. Through sessions like this, we begin to understand and we begin to find pathways for discovery of how to blunt and how to make anti-Semitism maybe something that will no longer be the longest hatred. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernie, for those words. I will look forward to hearing more of what you have to say. Now we get into a time where we're going to have the question and answers, and we put out an opportunity for community to ask questions, and we've collected a number of them that we're going to be asking. I'm going to ask all the panelists if you would be kind enough to turn on your cameras at this time so that those watching may see everyone, and this will give us an opportunity to interact with each other a little bit more, less formally than we've laid out so far. Rabbi Weiss, I want to start with you. You suggested in the planning for this event the title, The Longest Hatred. In tracing the roots of anti-Jewish myths, and as Bernie has said, rumors, hatred that dates back to the Roman Empire, what do you believe is necessary for this longest hatred to end?
That is the $1 million question. It's such a good question because it suggests that there's like a simple answer, and I'm not sure there is one simple answer. And I think it has a multi-pronged approach. In the past, there was anti-Semitism surrounding that Jews killed Christ. The church apologized for this in 1964. The Pope, on behalf of Christians of the world, said, we don't blame Jews anymore for that. But that sort of didn't end anti-Semitism completely from all Christians. There are probably still many who believe that. There are, as Bernie said, there are people that feel that Jews run the world, that we're behind COVID, or that we're behind these restrictions, and that's why they're protesting in Ottawa, and that those anti-Jewish Nazi symbolism came up. There's those who feel that Jews are worthless, or that we're somehow insidious, that we're behind things in an evil way. So I guess the best answer would be that education. Okay, that would be number one answer, would be education. I think that people in our schools, the children in our schools, need to understand and learn about what anti-Semitism is and the roots of it, and not just. And I think we're doing a much better job, especially in the Halton region, about diversity and inclusion, like a panel tonight. So it can start with anti-Semitism, but certainly I know other groups, other faith groups, other ethnic groups, other minorities also feel hatred. Judaism happens to be the longest hatred, as the title suggests, and it also happens to be when they do the hate crimes and they look at the statistics, the Jews are always the most victims. We are most often the victims. So I would say, I guess, education in our classrooms to understand it, to learn about it, to talk about it. I would say that in addition to that, the legislation coming from our government at high levels is very helpful. Sort of passing these definitions of anti-Semitism, making sure that hate crime is something that can be prosecuted properly by police, and that our courts can adequately use it as a tool for those that commit acts of hate and anti-Semitism, and will be punished accordingly and face consequences. I'm hoping that those two things are a combination. And I guess the third thing is bringing people together of different faiths. I sit on an interfaith council. I know Karen Mock has done so much in this area. So do you, Bernie, and CJ as well. When you bring people together for a book club, to share a meal, when I have Muslims in the synagogue and we sit together and talk about things, we lose all that worry about who's that other person, that sort of hatred, or what are they doing, and all of a sudden you're sitting together, you're talking, you're realizing the humanity in each other, that we are all people, that and then a lot of that hatred and that stereotypes, all those things seem to melt away. So I think bringing groups together also can help solve some of these issues around anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much for that, Stephen. And I'm just wondering if there are others who might want to jump in on that. I do support, what you just said, Stephen, about getting together and knowing others. I find that it's hard to hate people that you get to know. And I'm wondering, others, any other thoughts that you might have that you might want to add about what do we need to do? As Bernie suggests, we might not be able to end this, but at least to blunt this. Karen, go ahead.
I'd like to, of course, everyone has contributed exactly what the issues are, but I'd like to expand a little bit on the education aspect. Yes, education about anti-Semitism, but all of our education from the earliest childhood level on. The curriculum itself has to reflect Jewish people as well. When we heard from Sharon and Esther, what it's like to be, and we had some incidents in different school boards across this province where there could be a school of 1,500 kids and only 3 Jewish, and the taunting. Well, when there's May is Asian Heritage Month, but it's also Jewish Heritage Month. And then you hear of communities where there are lots of Asians and South Asians celebrating and doing all sorts of things for Asian history and Asian heritage, but not doing anything about Jewish Heritage Month. And then it reminds me of when we talked about how it was so important to have a multicultural, anti-racist curriculum, and you'd hear of people in predominantly white neighborhoods say, well, we don't have to have Black education. We don't have to do anti-racist education. We don't have a lot of Blacks here, so we don't have any problems. Well, no. It's not the Blacks who are causing the racism. It's the racists who are causing the racism. So it is not a diverse curriculum. It is not doing the education when the dominant culture or the dominant religion or the dominant race, you name it. I mean, these things are social constructs, but I know we're among people who understand the language. When that's the only thing that then marginalizes and silences other minorities or oppressed peoples. So in many ways, it goes beyond hatred. I like the fact that Jess, for example, pointed out the microaggressions, the systemic issues. People don't want to use the A word. They say, oh no, you're trying to silence us and put a chill. Well, a lot of us remember when people refused to use the R word and wouldn't use racism. But now we understand racism in all its forms. So is it anti-Semitic when the graduation exercises are on a Friday night and some kids can't come because it's a Sabbath? It's not Jew hatred, but we can use the A word in the same way as there are systemic racist things that happen in our schools that we wouldn't have known were racist, or it's people will say, oh no, but I don't hate Blacks. I just didn't realize that I was singling out that student for wearing a hat and didn't use the same punishment for other students. The systemic bias has to have a name, and whether it's the sin of omission in the curriculum we called racist when we didn't teach Black history and have inclusion of Blacks. The sin of omission when anti-Semitism is not included, or Jews are not included, or even in the social justice education curriculum, when it's the only ism not named. Those are examples, and we need to have that kind of inclusion right from the earliest childhood level. And also, why do we have the Enhancing Social Justice Education group now? Because even in teacher education, in some sectors, they have removed anti-Semitism and Holocaust education from the curriculum in social justice education. We want to enhance it by ensuring Islamophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, all the phobias and isms are included, and that we prepare our educators and our administrators much better that way by helping them name anti-Semitism in all its forms. That's the way we can counter it and put our theories and policies into practice.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. And thank you, Rabbi Weiss, for your statements. I'm going to pose another question that came into us. And this question said that on January the 27th, we marked Holocaust Remembrance Day. And today, as you know, we are at the start of February, which is Black History Month. How do you see a historical remembrance? How do you see historical remembrance as critical to the protection and dignity of Jewish and Black communities? And Karen, I know you touched on some of that intersectionality, and I'm wondering, Jess, if you would, I know you've done a lot of work around intersectionality, if you would want to start that conversation.
Thank you, Director. Absolutely. I think one of the pillars of Jewish identity, or two of the pillars of Jewish identity, I guess, are Zachor and Shamor, to observe and remember. Much of what we do, and I see the rabbi nodding, so I know I've done it correctly, that's very much rooted in our identity. When we light Shabbat candles on Friday night, there's the question of why 2 candles, right? Like for Hanukkah, we light a Hanukkah with 8 candles plus 1, a Shamash. Why 2? And it's a really important question that is rooted not only in religiosity, but in tradition and in spirituality and in upkeeping our culture. And the answer to that question is that the two pillars of Shabbat are to observe and to remember. You can reconcile your feelings about why you do what you do later, but Judaism isn't a religion or an ethno-religion of creed. It's one of deed, it's one of action. And so I very much believe that remembering and preserving memory is at the core of what Jewish people do. We are one of the oldest ethno-religions in the world. We're not the only one. There are many longstanding community groups like the Yazidis, which are a lesser known ethno-religious group. But it's so important to remember. I think we are in an era right now, especially that it was just International Holocaust Remembrance Day, in which we're questioning, as we get further away from the Holocaust and as we lose more survivors like my grandfather, and we have less access to firsthand testimony in person, like lots of those have been preserved, how do we combat the denial that is directly correlated to the loss of survivors, which we now know to be true? And so in combating denial and in combating misinformation, we have the obligation to not only remember, but to observe that remembrance. And that's done through Yom HaShoah, which is the Jewish Remembrance Day, in addition to the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is moreover for the secular community. But in doing so, something that is paramount to that experience is preserving the facts and accuracy. I love that when Bernie spoke, he used intentional language. It's difficult language to stomach and it is hard to hear, but it is important that we remember the Holocaust in all that it was, in all of its accuracy. So that is that Roma and Sinti and people with disabilities and homosexual men and political prisoners of war were also persecuted. And so the way that we remember and the way that we don't provide erasure as a Jewish community can set a tone. We are inviting people in and we're active in dialogue to make sure that we're combating misremembrance and misinformation. But I also think that there's a secondary answer here, if I might, which is that the Jewish community certainly cannot do this alone. The global population of Jews is 15.5 million today at the moment. And in 1939, the global Jewish population was 16.2 million. So we in 77 years have not recovered. And I was reminded about that on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But to be very frank, I feel that every single day. I know it in the essence of my being and in the fiber of my DNA that most of my family tree was exterminated. And so in preserving and in remembering, it is such a Jewish value. And the more that we invite people in to discuss why it's so important that we remember, we can instill those values onto other communities. I've worked extensively with the Rwandan genocide survivor community, and that has been a community that I have seen do amazing preservation work on remembrance. So I'll leave it there.
Let me also suggest, Mr. Director, if you don't mind, I love, Jess, that you use the word zachor. Zachor is remember. I mean, it is such a powerful Hebrew word. And the fact of the matter is that remembering gives us credibility for tomorrow. We're already seeing what I call genocide denial amongst First Nations critics. Now, can you imagine that they are actually denying the concept of residential schools as having been as harmful as First Nations people and Inuit and Métis claim? So it doesn't take long. As a matter of fact, great historians have told us that the final stage of genocide is in itself denial. So it's kind of interesting when non-Jews and others, and I can't remember if it was Esther or Sharon or one of us, talked about the fact that there are those within a poll that claim that Jews speak too much about the Holocaust. Well, frankly speaking, you're damn right. We are going to continue to speak about the Holocaust. We lost almost an entire generation in living memory. Do you know that there are, of course, Holocaust survivors around to this very day? They're in their 80s and they're in their 90s and we're losing them, but they are still here. And so for those that deny, to me, it's a humanity crime. But it's even more than that, because it denies history, and it erases our history and who we are as people. So Zachor if we come away with anything tonight, remember, Zachor.
Thank you so much, Bernie. I'm wondering if Esther or Sharon would like to jump in on anything they've heard so far, any comments, feedback that you might want to give on either, the longest hatred, your sort of take on that, or any work that you've been doing around intersectionality and why we need to work together. Esther?
I think that, what everyone has said has been so amazing, especially what Jess was saying about how in Judaism, remembrance is such a deep part of who we are. And I think oftentimes I find myself thinking that, we're not Jewish because of our religion, we're not Jewish, because of anything else, but we really are a people. And when you look at Jews in different parts of our culture, the retainment of knowledge and the deep connection to our ancestors is so alive within us all. Even, for example, when you look at Jewish burials, oftentimes people from other cultures, other religions, they'll leave roses on gravestones, they'll leave notes, maybe they'll leave, toys or something that their past relative or friend enjoyed. In Judaism, we place rocks on gravestones because rocks are forever and they help to preserve the memory of that person. And on Friday nights, Saturday mornings, we say prayers to remember all of our past loved ones, and we all go around in a congregation and we say the names out loud so that they're all within all of our hearts, and so that we are collectively praying as a people for each other. And I think that is just such a special part of who we are. But then also, of course, going along with that, there is such intergenerational trauma with our people that is still present in the older generations, in even myself, even in younger generations. I teach at my shul, as was mentioned in my bio, and even on Saturdays when I teach young children as young as 4, we have to talk to them sometimes about how there's anti-Semitism and how there's hatred, and that they're going to have to face these things. And it's the most heartbreaking thing to have a 4-year-old come up to you, almost in tears, saying, like, why do people hate me? What did I do wrong? Why did so-and-so say this? And that is so incredibly hurtful. And, of course, again, as was mentioned before, we're losing Holocaust survivors. And I think it's difficult sometimes for people when they don't hear firsthand recounts truly of what happened, because I can talk about the Holocaust, Cher can talk about the Holocaust, Karen can talk about the Holocaust, but it's a lot more powerful when we hear it from somebody who actually went through that, and who talks about their experiences going through a concentration camp, or who talks about their experiences of having to flee their country and come to a completely new place with nothing except for the clothes on their back. And so remembrance is such an integral part of that. And unfortunately, as we get further and further away from the Holocaust, I find that we're starting to lose that. And not only the Holocaust, there's, plenty of massive anti-Semitic events that have happened in history that we never talk about because unfortunately people have forgotten about them. Anti-Semitism has been going on for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The Holocaust did not, start anti-Semitism. It wasn't the end of anti-Semitism. And so as we kind of move further away from that, as we see, places remove books such as Mouse, which are graphic novels that illustrate the Holocaust stories, or as school curriculums remove books such as those, or as we kind of start to rethink our language, we start to rethink the kind of things that we teach our students. It's unfortunate that we're slowly starting to forget that, and the moment that we start to forget what happened to our people, that's when we give way, and that's when we allow for anti-Semitism to thrive, for it to be okay. And of course, that would lead to another, unfortunately, a big horrific thing happening. And it's just really upsetting to see that. So absolutely, remembrance is something that we need to work on by way of education, by way of politicians, the language that we use, rethinking old anti-Semitic tropes and how we can kind of unravel those and understand them, and try and kind of move on from them, learn, unlearn. I mean, there is so much to know when it comes to anti-Semitism, just because it has been going on for so long, and it truly is so interwoven with our society, really everything that we do. But absolutely, remembrance is a very, very, very important thing that we need to do, at least in terms of stopping, anti-Semitism and learning about our people.
Thank you for that, Esther. Karen, I see you want to jump in. Go ahead.
That was beautifully said, Esther. The other thing, we remember what Santiana taught us, that those who do not know history are bound to repeat it. And one of the, I guess we call it one of the lessons of the Holocaust, is the power of propaganda, and how ordinary people, when they are fed lies, when they're looking for someone to blame for their problems, when a demagogue comes to power and spews those lies, ordinary people believe them. Goebbels taught everyone well, the more you repeat the lies, the more people will believe them. And this is what's happening today. I mean, we used to say, what would have happened if the Nazis had a fax machine? Well, what would have happened if they had the internet? And when you think how quickly, without knowledge, without history, without the facts, without the learning, and without the teaching of right from wrong, it's so important, as Rabbi Weiss said, for people to get together with people from other faiths. But the research in psychology has taught us, with the bystanders and with those who were the rescuers, those who stood up to rescue, were not the ones who knew the people, but they were the ones who had been taught right from wrong, and the ones who had been taught the difference between good and evil. And they were not followers. They didn't follow the crowd. If there was an exception. So our teachers, our educators need to know this. I mean, God forbid somebody should ever say, oh, I'm tired of hearing about slavery. That happened so many years ago. We would name that as racism.
Oh, they do say that, Karen.
Yes, they do. And what do we call them? Of course they say that. And then what do we call them? And the same, I mean, it's this, when people say, oh, we're tired of hearing about your Holocaust. It was so long ago. And then yet will not name their denial, or will not name literally their aggressions against Jews because of the privilege that others have. So again, it's not having it as a one-shot thing. There are so many aspects of this that I'm not talking about using the Holocaust, but I'm saying if we teach also Holocaust education in the context of anti-racist, anti-oppression, inclusion education, that they recognize the telltale signs of totalitarian thinking wherever it is. It can be anti-immigrant, it can be you name it. But that is why it's so important that we not only remember, but that we teach and we show the connections, the connectivity in these aspects, and how easy it is to take somebody and just turn their mind because they don't know and they don't have the knowledge. And the teacher or the media, they have the power. So if they bring their own political agenda into the classroom and their own anti-Semitism into the classroom, they are abusing the very power that they are trying to teach people not to abuse. We now still find that it is the bullies who can get their anti-Semitic tropes across. And it is the bullies, if they speak louder because they've got a political agenda or they get those resources into the classrooms, then there's no one that can counter that because the education has not been such that they can stem that before it takes over.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I wanted to jump to Sharon. Sharon, Esther mentioned, teaching the young ones, as young as 4. I was wondering that a question that we had was, how early is too early to start teaching, our young people about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I completely agree that education is really important. And I think it starts with simple conversations about inclusion and anti-Semitism kind of is important in that conversation as well. And it depends on like the age is kind of hard to say like a specific age because it really depends on the maturity of the child and the experiences that child has. But if you're instilling those values of inclusion in that child, you would hope that it could bring, when they face anti-Semitic remarks or any of those situations, that they can take the values that they've been instilled even from a really young age, such as 4, like Esther was talking about, when they're experiencing these things and making sure that you're addressing them as before they face them or as they do. And I think I just want to add to that. I think it's really important to understand the perspective of the people who are creating these anti Semitic marks and saying these things, because to be able to really break down why this hatred exists, we have to understand the perspective of the people who are spreading these myths and these lies and really breaking down where that comes from and being able to teach those people the history and the truth behind it and how hurtful all of those actions are as well.
Thank you so much. I want to jump back to something that Karen said, and anyone on the panel can speak to this. Karen, you mentioned something about propaganda, and UNESCO recently reflected that the Holocaust began with words. And in the internet and social media era, the power of propaganda is more devastating than ever. Do you agree that the power of propaganda is strong enough to overcome the instinct for inclusion? And what is necessary to overcome the power of propaganda? Who'd like to start? I see Esther and then Stephen.
I mean, this is definitely an issue that is very unfortunately near and dear to my heart. Um, as we see now in the age of social media, this is most of the time where young people get their information from, and unfortunately, um, our views, our social media caters to our views. It's so easy to search for posts or infographics or news articles that agree with our opinions and not the opinions of other people or the voices of other people. Um, and it's so incredibly easy to spread all of this false information. And of course, a lot of people don't fact check, they don't look for secondary sources. So, um, all throughout the time I've had any kind of social media like Instagram or Snapchat or especially TikTok, there has just been such awful levels of anti-Semitism absolutely everywhere, in comment sections, in people just posting completely blatantly false things. And of course that's harmful to our community, especially to young people who are on social media, who are so impressionable and who, they learn through what they see, they learn through what their friends say, they learn through what they hear from their parents. Of course they're not going to go look up news articles or read a book or whatnot, and so that's incredibly harmful. And as people are younger and younger and younger now that they're more on social media, this just sort of brings it into their real life, into the way that they view their friends, into the way that even people view their colleagues. I can say most recently that last semester I did a semester abroad in Israel, and during my time there was, much tension, as there usually is, but unfortunately this escalated into a war, and there were something like, 4,500 rockets that were fired in a day. And I just remember I was in chemistry class, and then we heard the sirens go off because we got a threat from Hamas saying that they were going to bomb Jerusalem, which was the area that we were in. And at first we didn't really think much of it. Israel often gets these threats. Hamas's rockets are quite crude and they can't really aim properly. And of course, Jerusalem is a holy space, so it doesn't often get attacked. But unfortunately, this time it did. And the sirens went off, and I just had to sprint as fast as I could into a washroom because I wasn't near a bomb shelter. And I remember one of my friends had to run in, and I opened the door, and this bomb just went off, and everything shook, and everybody just went silent for a minute. There was something like 10 of us crammed into this tiny washroom. And, of course, we were all completely shocked and stunned and silent in that moment. We really didn't know what to do, what to think. And of course, this continued for a little bit where we would have to run into bomb shelters. We would have to find a washroom to hide in. We went to sleep with the sound of bombs over our head and, the air being filled with smoke hurting your lungs and the ground constantly shaking from the sound of explosions, seeing fire everywhere. And of course, my Israeli friends crying because, they were worried about their families. We were worried about our friends in Tel Aviv. We were worried about our families dying. And all throughout this time, when you're fearing for your life, when you're hugging your friends, saying prayers that you say before you die, calling your family so incredibly worried, not being with them through this extremely traumatic experience, all through social media, all I saw were people, random people. We would just wake up to them saying death threats to us, saying that we were just white colonizers, saying that we're living in this apartheid state, saying that Zionism is this settler colonial ideology, that, we're baby killers, that we should have died with our families, that Hitler, should have finished his job and burned us all. And, even seeing my friends repost what was popular at the time were these infographics that were like debunking Zionism, debunking Judaism, debunking Israel and whatnot, really demonizing us. And I can't explain to you how incredibly hurtful it is just to go online every single day, see, everything flooded with extreme anti-Semitism, having death threats, having your friends say all of these things, meanwhile being bombed and fearing for your life. And I mean, it is just incredibly awful. So social media unfortunately does sort of pave the way, I think, for all of these hateful things to come up. And then of course, a lot of times people's voices are pushed down when, Jews, we want to talk about anti-Semitism, we're told that we're just crying anti-Semitism, that we talk way too much about it, that it's not such an issue, that we're privileged. And I mean, so anyways, like you were saying, words and propaganda especially absolutely can cause people to do such atrocious things as we've seen before so many times in the past. Anti-Semitism was always there before the Holocaust, and Hitler wasn't the person who created this whole thing, who created all these conspiracy theories. Of course, there were many other complicit people, but it just starts with morphing words and talking to people and really delivering a hateful message. And of course, when people are struggling financially, when people are they see people more successful than them, it's easy to blame another group of people who seems like they're, so successful, who seems like they have it all, who seems like they have what you want. It's easy to point to these people saying, oh, they're the problem. Look at all these people causing the problem. And then, of course, from there, spinning this whole web of lies. Unfortunately, that does happen. It is still happening. It has always been happening. And like we've said before, truly education is the best way to combat that, but really looking and unlearning the institutions that have upheld this, are books that still, contain anti-Semitism, are curriculums, are textbooks even, and really breaking down on that and learning and unlearning. Unfortunately, it's easy now in the digital age, of course, for propaganda to spread, and as Karen was saying, anti-Semitism sorts of comes in this waves. In one way or another, it's always there. Sometimes it's truly awful. Sometimes, it's there, but it's tolerable. But absolutely, looking at words, looking at language, looking at social media, if it's so easy for anti-Semitism to spread and to get to such intense levels through propaganda, through words, through things that people are saying, it's 10 times more difficult to stop that and go back from that, especially when you've grown up with this, especially when that's all you see. And that is extremely difficult, but it's definitely something that is necessary to do.
Thank you, Esther, for sharing your heart and some of the trauma that you've been through. Rabbi Wise, words, do they matter? You're muted, Rabbi Wise.
I was just saying my words don't matter much because we have someone like Esther who can so eloquently speak. I'd like to make a TikTok of her, if I'm even using that right, but if she could do this in sound bites and sort of combat the misinformation and those infographics that describe, you know, what was happening during that war last May, and have short videos of Esther sort of speaking truth and her experience. And thanks, Esther. She speaks up like this a lot in our classes, and she's a real inspirational student and teacher, as you heard. I also just want to give some of my time to Sharon, because I know Sharon, being on campus, like at McMaster, a lot of Jewish students don't feel comfortable because the propaganda at some of the universities, including McMaster. And I wonder maybe if you could just share a little bit about maybe things you've seen on campus or heard, and has it gotten better? I know it's, coronavirus over the past 2 years, not quite the campus experience you anticipated, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, Sharon.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely, as like a member of the Hillel community, we've always been trying to like get more people involved and going to our events and everything like that. But often students don't really want to identify themselves as Jewish and just kind of go into the crowd and not really be noticed, because there are organizations like BDS and McMaster actively saying that they support them and making Jewish students sometimes feel uncomfortable by some of their statements. And it's really hard to really identify yourself as a Jewish student and still feel comfortable on your campus and participate in all these Jewish events, because not everyone has the same opinion, and that's okay. But at the same time, you have to eliminate the hatred from that. You can have a different opinion, but that doesn't mean that you can target a certain group for the actions of a country like Israel. You have to be able to separate those two things, or you create an environment where people like Jewish people aren't comfortable. And it extends to not just Jewish people, also to like Black students and Indigenous students and all different communities, being able to really provide an inclusive environment and separate your opinions of specific people from your political opinions as well. And so it's often difficult, and I think is something we might talk about a bit later. I also wanted to add a little bit about the social media aspect in terms of how to overcome that. I think it's really important to make sure that people are really critical of what they're reposting and what they're looking at. And it's something that really should be taught, how to look at something on the internet and actually not just take it at face value. We really shouldn't just be looking at everything we see and accepting it as truth, because it often isn't the case. And to be fact checking and making sure we know our history and where that information came from is really the best way to overcome all this propaganda, because that's where we can find the truth within all of these different opinions. And especially with social media, the way their algorithms work are to give you more information that you agree with and have this confirmation bias of having a certain opinion and then continually perpetuating it and not necessarily seeing the other side, because those are the only people you engage with. So being able to provide like students in schools with different perspectives, and also finding ways for even like social media companies to recognize that and make sure that they're eliminating like anti-Semitism and other hatred as well.
So thanks for that, Sharon. I mean, certainly, so our social media companies have a role to play as well, in their algorithms, that should perhaps provide some other viewpoints that people don't live in this echo chamber of hate. I'm wondering, Bernie, you mentioned rumors and, propaganda, and Jess, I wanted you to jump in as well. Let's hear your thoughts.
If the whole concept of social media has actually changed hate, if I could put it that way. Back in the day, Karen will remember this, the others maybe not as much, maybe the rabbi, but back in the 80s and 90s, when groups like the Heritage Front and other neo-Nazi groups were present, how did they get their point out there? Well, they used to stand at the corner of Yonge and Bloor, and they would hand out leaflets. And if 10 people took those leaflets those hateful leaflets, that was considered a pretty good day. Today, with social media, all you have to do is get onto TikTok or Twitter or Facebook or Telegraph or 4chan. I mean, there's so many possibilities. And of course, there are always the dark corners of social media. And you can potentially reach not tens of people, not hundreds of people, tens of thousands of people. Now, if you think about that for a moment, tens of thousands of people, if only a small percentage of those are really the intense ones, are really the true haters. So how many are we talking about in Canada? 5,000, 10,000, 15,000? And if of those, how many are we afraid may actually take action? Like we've seen, sadly, in London, Ontario, with the murder of an entire Muslim family, or in Quebec City, where somebody has actually walked into a place of worship and murdered peaceful Muslims at prayer, or in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they walked into a shul, into a synagogue, the Temple of Life synagogue, and murdered 11 Jews on a Sabbath. I mean, how many does it take of the tens of thousands of people that can be reached by social media? Does it take 100? Does it take 50? It really just takes one person listening once, deciding that they're going to go out there and get the Jews, or they're going to go out there and get the blacks, or they're going to go out there and get the Indians, whatever the case may be. And that makes me afraid. I have to be very honest. It makes me afraid. It didn't make me afraid 20 years ago because we didn't have that experience 20 years ago. Social media has radicalized, and it has given the ability to actually go and suck in young people into their vortex of hatred. And I'm afraid for the future, if education facilities and others, the police, the authorities, the law, we will need law. We will need good law along with everything else in order to fight this. And this is a battle, make no mistake about it. This is a battle for the souls and the minds of our young people, and the bad guys are winning. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Bernie. Jess? And Karen, I know you started this conversation about propaganda, and I could just tell that you're just itching to get back in there and add something. But Jess, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I think it's interesting. I like to think of things theoretically, but also I conduct a lot of research, and I work in less theoretical spaces and am pretty quantitatively driven by data. So one of the things I want to comment on is the organization that I work for, CEJA, was part of an online coalition to combat online hate. With a bunch of different groups like the Federation of Black Canadians and the World Sikh Organization, and many different Indigenous groups, and lots of groups that are currently experiencing violence, specifically in the online space. And I want to comment on many different truths I've heard. One, Esther said, was really important. During times of economic crisis and health crisis, historically and in the contemporary, we see a rise of hate. So that is true for anti-Semitism. It's absolutely true for xenophobia, anti-Chinese racism, and anti-Asian hate more generally. And so I think naming that is really important. There are actually solutions to online hate. Specifically, there are 3 kind of tracks that we can follow to regulate the online space. One of them is regulatory solutions, whether or not, especially because, I, much like Esther, got death threats online. I do have a pretty prominent social media presence. And when that violence is coming from somewhere is one of the questions, since the digital space is not necessarily confined within borders. And then what responsibility do the moderators of these platforms or the owners of these platforms have in regulating safe spaces, whether that's TikTok or Facebook, Google, the way the algorithm works, etc. So there is the regulatory track is one thing that absolutely needs to be discussed in terms of combating online hate. Another one is actually defining what constitutes hate. For example, criminalizing Holocaust denial on Canadian ground. We know that to be illegal in Germany. You are not allowed to deny the Holocaust. It is a federal offense. Holocaust denial is not illegal everywhere, including in Canada. So regulating what is defined as hate, and that requires the groups to come to consensus definitions. So for me, the definition I fall into is IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. There are many different definitions and different reasons folks use them. The reason I fall to that one is of the 16.2 million Jews worldwide, more than half of them live in Israel, over 7.5 million. And so the definition might seem a little Israel-centric at times, But my spouse, for example, she's from Israel. And much like Esther's experience, her Safta, her grandmother, had to sleep in a corridor, in a hallway, a stairwell for several nights during the bombings because she has a mobility consideration and could not get up and down stairs to make it to a bomb shelter in 90 seconds. So instead, you have a 94-year-old grandmother sleeping in a stairwell. And so the way that we regulate online spaces, the way that we define hate, the way that we protect people, for me and my identity coming from the Middle East, is a definition that encompasses that. So what is online hate? What is anti-Black hate and anti-Black racism? What is anti-Asian hate? What is anti-Indigenous hate, including the denial of residential schools? And it's for each group to come up with what their definitions is, and then for the platforms to enforce those. And the other regulatory track would be raising public awareness of online hate, specifically how online violence doesn't stay online and how online violence becomes perpetrated in physical spaces. An example of that is in 2018, there was the massacre that happened, and I use different words, whether it's massacre or mass murder, at Squirrel Hill at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And that massacre ended up killing 11 people, all of whom were elderly and all of whom also had mobility considerations. The reason the death toll was not higher, God forbid, was because synagogues routinely go through lockdown training, active shooter training, because this is not something that is new for us. The person who perpetrated this violence and this mass murder was in online chat rooms talking about world Jewish control and conspiracy theories of Jews, that Jewish people were the reason that migrants and immigrants were getting in at the Mexican border, and had this perception of control. So that traces back both to how words matter and how the online space matters. This person perpetrated an attack that murdered 11 people, one of whom was actually from Toronto, who got married and moved to Pittsburgh. So there absolutely are undeniable and unwavering roots to home here for us. And we recognize that online violence doesn't stay online, and that doesn't only impact Jewish people, that impacts all people. So the treatment of Jews in society tends to be a pretty decent litmus test for how other people are being treated. That has been historically true through cliches like the canary in the coal mine. And I guess these things might be cliches for a reason, but I think that both words matter and that regulatory tracks for online hate are essential. And so we actually do have tools. We run symposiums, legal conferences. I think it's time to put those words into actions and to start, promoting actual steps. If you're interested in taking steps online, I'm sure that I can send to you, Director Ennis, different links for folks to actually take action against this, because people are organizing. The Black Parents Group in Toronto is amazing in terms of regulating online spaces. And so I'll leave it there. Again, I'll pass it back to Dr. Mock, I think wanted to speak. But it becomes less and less hypothetical as more research is available to us and as more experiences are shared. And I certainly think that the contemporary has highlighted a lot for us, specifically how online violence leads to offline violence. But with all due respect, a mass tragedy or shooting against Jews happened in 2018, and we've made little steps to regulating online violence. So I would implore people to look at how they can get involved, because time is certainly of the essence.
Thanks, Jess. And Dr. Karen Mock, you started this conversation about propaganda.
I'm doing something called kvelling right now. Kvelling in Yiddish means there's a special pride that you have, because it really is the next generation. And Jess has just summed it all up perfectly, and so did Sharon, and so did Esther. I'm going to add just one thing, and that's to come to the education system again. In addition to everything that they said, when we were all worried about the impact of television, we did this amazing kind of research and so on. And we had programs for teacher education and in classrooms on media literacy. And then there was the whole vogue of critical thinking. Again, that research I referred to you, the classical research of who were the rescuers at the time of the Holocaust. It was the critical thinkers, the one who evaluated when the propaganda was coming. And they say, well, wait a minute, all Jews couldn't be like this, or I'm not a follower, because I know I've had role models, I've had the training. I mean, they didn't think it through that way, but they could tell when they were being lied to. And that's the only thing I would add to what the others have said. What is happening today in teacher education? When we were asked to come in and do some training, and a school board not too far from where you are, because there had been some incidents of anti-Semitism, which the students didn't think was anti-Semitic, but it turned out that they didn't have the critical thinking skills to evaluate the resources that were being thrown at them. And so they didn't mean to accept a modern day version of the blood libel. They didn't, and at the same time, it doesn't have to come out of my mouth what is and isn't anti-Semitic. It could come out of the mouths of the teachers, of the educators. It's up to a Jewish person to help other Jewish people understand what Islamophobia is. It's up to others when they work together, when you have a team that's diverse coming in and doing the teacher education. And one last thought, again, in the putting theory and policy into practice, we know from cognitive developmental learning theory that you don't take complicated concepts and just have a one-shot lesson on them, that we have to meet people where they are in their thinking, and we have to provide a unit that will take 3 weeks to do. We don't have a one-shot, on Anti-Racism Day, we'll do a March 21st thing on racism. One time isn't enough. So it's the providing the unit, providing the background, providing and building, taking people from where they are in their thinking and their understanding to where you want them to be, so that the critical thinker, when they see the TikTok come across and it's a lie, will know that they've got to evaluate it or check it out with a secondary source. Again, on the other sides of the web that are insidious, you can't dialogue with someone who wants to kill you. When we have the real extremes that have those loud voices and use their resources to promote hate, it's hard to counter that. But it's the majority of the population who needs to have the more extensive, inclusive anti-racism work, which must include anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mock. At this time, we are going to bring our evening to a close, but I'm going to ask if each of you would take 60 seconds just to give us your closing thoughts. And I'm going to start with you, Bernie.
Well, one thing I would really like to say is I want to thank Sharon and Esther and Jess. I am the generation of my parents. I am the last generation. This is the new generation. And I learned a lot from the three of you, and of course from Rabbi Weiss as always. And I want to thank you, Curtis, for starting this process. There aren't many school boards that are actually doing this, so kudos to you. And let me just sum up, if I can. I mean, again, we're talking about 1,000, 2,000 years of hatred that has gone in cycles, where Jews have been murdered in incredible numbers, where there have been lulls in history, and up to today with what we're facing, where once again it appears as though Jews, most specifically, are being targeted. And Jess spoke of getting death threats. Karen and I can tell you that year after year, and especially now, even very lately, after I spoke out about swastikas on Parliament Hill during this so-called Freedom Convoy, I'm used to seeing swastikas, taped onto telephone posts and scratched onto synagogues, and it troubles me and it hurts me terribly. But I have to tell you that watching on television and seeing someone carrying a swastika flag, another crude swastika scratched into the Canadian flag, I found it horrifying. And I found it horrifying not because it was a swastika, which is horrifying enough, but because there were thousands of people there and nobody did anything. Nobody said, why is there a swastika flying amongst us? Nobody tore it down. And that gives me great pause. Listening and understanding what's going on, and having spoken out about that publicly, I can tell you this entire week was filled with hate messages, death threats, you name it. It's just the kind of thing that we're facing again. So Your timing is sadly perfect. I'm glad, for lack of a better term, that we were able to have this conversation. I'm glad that it was gender equal. I'm glad that it was ableist equal. I'm glad that it was divided in such a way that the voices of the young and the voices of the experienced came together to begin, and it is the beginning of a dialogue that must continue and then must intersect when we speak with our friends in the Black community, the Asian community, the Indigenous community, the LGBTQ plus community. We have to find ways to work together and walk in each other's shoes, as many of us have done, and learn the lessons for tomorrow. And thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Bernie. And I just want to thank you so much for contributing this evening. I'm going to just ask Rabbi Weiss, your turn.
Thanks. How many Jews are in Halton region, right? Esther and Sharon, you talked about being one of the only Jews in your class, and yet the Halton District School Board has chosen to use this venue to approach this really important topic. I think that really speaks highly of our region and of our school board, that you would understand that the small minority can have a big voice to play, because, as we've talked about, if it happens to us, it can happen to anybody. And I wonder what it would be like if we could dream of like having an opportunity for the teachers of this region to get together and to brainstorm, have an incredible curriculum using some of the panelists that are with us tonight. Jewel, Curtis, I'm here. I'm ready to work with you. I'm ready to help create that curriculum, to get it into the hands of teachers, not just hand them a book or something or a piece of paper, but to like sit with them, learn with them, talk to them, hear their ideas, and brainstorm together some sort of incredible curriculum that we could really use what we learned tonight to teach these kids. And I'm ready. I'm ready to work with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Weiss. We appreciate the collaboration and the spirit in which we work together. Jess, your turn.
Thank you. Much like everyone else, I want to thank you for this opportunity and for having this panel. It's timely now and always. I'm very impressed by the Halton District School Board for hosting this panel. And it is a privilege and an honor to be here. So I want to thank you for that. I think it's very hard to hate someone who sits at the table with you. I have based most of my work on that idea because I've experienced it. I had friends who went to Israel and Palestine for their honeymoon after spending significant time with my family and I, that never would have gone, that ended up writing beautiful poems about their experience and how in Haifa people switched between Hebrew and Arabic and English and all the little anecdotes and being called honey and handed your coffee and what that was like and how it was a world away and very different from what they had thought. I have a friend who called me to check in after an address by an elected official, discussed the hate symbols at the current protests and demonstrations, and said, I was so disappointed to not hear anti-Semitism named. My hijabi Muslim friend called me to say, how are you doing? This was a terrible speech. I want to check in. And so I modeled a lot of my work off of the Pluralism Project by Diana Eck at Harvard and founded and co-founded a project called the Kaleidoscope Project and worked on it extensively at the University of Calgary, in which over the course of 6 days, students at the university level go through an immersive learning experience across 6 major world religions. We go to a Gurdwara and experience the Sikh community and what it is to be in that gendered space. We saw people bringing bags of milk and dairy and vegetables and how no one works in the kitchen, but everybody works in the kitchen. I went to 3 different masjids and mosques, from the Husseini Association to a Sunni mosque and to the Ismaili Center. On the day that's Jewish, I went to a synagogue that was very much like mine and one that was very much nothing like mine. On the Christian day, I got to meet someone who was from the Orthodox community, a Coptic Orthodox, and someone asked, what is your favorite Bible verse? And it wasn't like evangelical Christianity where you recite Psalms or different quotes. He said, I don't really know verses from the Bible that well. What I know is 1,500 years of Orthodox history. And I thought, wow, that's so similar to being Jewish in ways. It is very hard to hate someone you spend time with. Diversify your networks, listen to different people, be involved in interfaith and interreligious spaces, become more interculturally competent, listen to different movies, documentaries, go to a different restaurant when it's safe to do so. push yourself outside of your own little comfort zone and get to know people who are nothing like you. And although I've done quite a bit of talking, it's very difficult to learn with your mouth open. So sit down and listen to others. Podcasts are a great place to begin. And I encourage everyone, it has been the biggest growth that I've gone through, more than education, more than work and professional experience, has been just sitting in conversation with others. I'm actually planning a trip to Jordan right now to go sit with people that are very different from me. And so I would encourage you to do that.
Thanks, Jess. I believe it was Bernie's dad who told him that to get anything done, you have to open your mouth. That's I think that came back to me as you said that. So thank you so much for that. I think next we have Sharon.
Hi, like everyone mentioned, I'm really grateful to have been a part of this panel and to kind of get to know everyone here. As mentioned before, I think it's really important to be critical of the information around you and to open your perspective to other people and hear what they have to say, because that's the way we're going to break down all the anti-Semitism that exists and really understand where these people are coming from and make sure that we teach open-mindedness in our classrooms, that just because you were taught one thing, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the absolute truth, and being open to learning other people's opinions and ideas and history is really important to breaking down all hatred that exists. And it definitely won't happen overnight, but I think having things like curriculums in the classroom, really breaking down those barriers and talking about those different things. And also, from my experiences, like sometimes there wasn't anti-Semitism talked about in my classrooms growing up in the Halton District School Board. And I think having those curriculums put in place so that as a Jewish person in the classroom, when World War II comes up, I don't feel kind of singled out and everyone thinks like, oh, she must know everything about it because she's the Jewish student in the classroom. It's really important that teachers are able to facilitate that conversation without putting pressure on Jewish students in the classroom too, and being really aware of how that information also impacts them as well. So as I said, thank you so much for having me, and I hope that this conversation continues with everyone watching and everyone here.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And Esther, I think you've heard enough from everybody here tonight how proud we are of you. I'm proud of everybody here, but I'm especially proud of you because you're one of our students. And just the courage with which you've spoken, the clarity with which you've shared, and the heart with which you've just put forward your ideas, we're incredibly proud of you as a student. Esther, go ahead.
First of all, again, like as everybody said, I would just like to thank you so much for this amazing opportunity. As Jews, we so rarely get the chance to speak about us and to speak about our problems and to have our voices amplified. And this is just such an incredible thing that it's happening. And it makes me so just overjoyed that we get this platform and we just get a space to share our voices and to answer questions and, to debunk things and talk about our own personal anecdotes. I guess to close this off, I guess I would just say a few things. The first is to just really be critical of what kind of media you're consuming, of what kind of people you're around, and to really listen to Jewish voices when we say something is wrong or when we say something isn't right, or that, if we call somebody out or say what they said was anti-Semitic, or, even something, sometimes we have to correct teachers, sometimes we have to talk to them about textbooks. The curriculum is definitely something that I think needs to be looked at. As Jews, we are such a wonderfully diverse group of people. We have, all different other ethnicities, not just Ashkenazi Jews. We have Jews of color, we have queer Jews, and I just think that's such a beautiful part of who we are as a people, but we don't get to learn about that in school, and that's not taught in school. The only thing we learn is a one-day class that's about, an hour and 15 minutes long about some genocide that happened to us, and then a different group of people that saved us, not what we were doing for ourselves. I think it's important that we don't stray away from uncomfortable things that, we don't usually talk about at the dinner table, like politics, money, racism, religion. That's definitely something that we do need to be teaching people, not something that we just kind of talk about or brush under the table or dismiss, or While Canada is a wonderfully diverse place, we can't act like it's a perfect place. We can't act like we don't have real problems. In reality, we are, just as anti-Semitic, just as racist as many other countries. We just kind of put it in the back door. We cover it up with other things. Often we cloak these things in the language of progress. And then also just, I think it's important to realize how proud of a people Jews are. As Barry Weiss said, we are the ever-dying people who refuse to die. We are a people who have nearly 4,000 years of civilized history, and through all of the anti-Semitism, through all of the efforts to exterminate our people, we really saw this emergence of this new generation of strong and powerful Jews who are so outspoken and rediscovering who we are and getting back to our roots, and that is such a beautiful thing. So I guess I would just end us off really by saying, listen to your Jewish friends, listen to what we have to say, be critical of what you consume, and it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to unlearn something that you previously thought was okay. And just overall, again, I would just like to thank everybody so much for having me, for giving us a space to talk. I think we are all incredibly grateful that we have that opportunity, which we don't often have, to see this diversity of different ages, people from different backgrounds. I think that's such a wonderful thing. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Esther. And Dr. Karen Mock, the last word goes to you.
Well, again, I want to thank you so much, and it's a hard act to follow when you're giving the last word after such eloquent presentations. So I guess what I want to say is, to sum it all up, it reminds me of something I heard in a recent Star Wars movie that said, they can win because they convince you that you're alone, and you're not alone. I can't stress enough the value of networks and recognizing that no school board has to start from scratch and no organization has to start from scratch, that we can build on what already exists. There are lots of resources out there. And I think right now, when I look at the screen, I see people who have those resources that they're willing to share, and as was already said, when we have to review the curriculum and review the textbooks, the piece also is we have to recognize the capital P and small p politics behind all of this. And there are those who don't want the anti-racist, anti-oppression, inclusive diversity education framework to succeed. And, the funding gets cut off. And there's, we did a manual once called Taking Action Against Hate, Protection, Prevention, and Partnerships. Well, we've already covered the protection, prevention, and partnerships on this conversation, but too often it deteriorates into competition, contention, and controversy. But we have got the partners of the different generations, of the different communities, and the networks. I encourage people in the school board to look into the Equity Summit Group, those who are doing your human rights, equity, and diversity work. Encourage them to look to the different community organizations that are represented here. The different interfaith, as was already said, and the multicultural anti-racist organizations. And we have to continue to be optimistic. We couldn't be in this work for so long if we didn't really feel that we can make a difference, to open a mouth, to work together. Together, we're stronger. And I certainly pledge to continue that as long as I've got a breath in me. And when I look at the next generations coming forward, the future's in good hands, and we really can make a difference. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. And I want to thank all of you once again for participating in this. And I just, Bernie, as you were talking about the picture that you were painting on Parliament Hill, I am reminded of the word of Elie Wiesel, who said that the opposite of hate is not love, it's indifference. And, it's the indifference that we're combating. And so I'm challenging all of the members and staff of the Halton District School Board community not to be indifferent about anti-Semitism, but to face it head on, to deal with it each and every day, and to make sure that the rich history of Jewish people are included in our curriculum, each and every day that we enter our spaces. So thank you so much for sharing. I know we're going to continue our collaboration and our work together. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Jewel Amoah, and I want to thank Dr. Amoah for all her work in putting this together as well, working alongside me. And so Dr. Amoah, thank you so much for your work. And thank you once again, panel. Over to you, Jewel.
Thank you, Director Ernest. And I just want to express my thanks and gratitude to all of the panelists for your contributions, your insights, and your very, very personal stories. They were very moving, and I think everybody has walked away from here this evening transformed because of the integrity you brought to the conversations and the insights. And so with that, I'll put in a plug for the next in our directors panel series on identity, inclusion, and human rights. On February 28th, we will have a panel on Black excellence. March 31st, there will be a panel on transgender awareness. April 26th, we will look at decolonizing approaches to education and land. And rounding the year off on May 31st, we will look at perspectives on Islam. So I hope everybody in the audience can join us for those upcoming events, and certainly hope you panelists will be interested to continue engaging these events from the other side of the screen. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.